Margaret Hollis did not cry when the door clicked shut behind her, sealing off 23 years of her life in a single metallic snap. That was the most frightening part of all. Not the sound itself, but the hollow silence that followed, as though someone had reached into her chest and switched off everything vital. For over 2 decades, she had slept in the same master bedroom, cooked over the same polished granite stove, laundered the clothes of a man she believed she knew, as well as her own reflection. She had ironed his shirts on Sunday evenings while he watched football, had packed his lunches with the crusts cut off, because he preferred them that way, had smiled at his colleagues during holiday parties, and pretended the bruise on her wrist was from bumping into the kitchen counter. She had done all of this with the quiet, practiced precision of a woman who had long ago confused survival with love. Now she stood on the sidewalk of their quiet suburban street in Northern Virginia, gripping the handle of a rolling suitcase that squeaked with every hesitant movement, and the world felt entirely alien. The afternoon sun hung at 3 o'clock, merciless and indifferent, beating down on her shoulders and illuminating the tiny particles drifting through the air, like witnesses too small to testify. Across the street, Mrs. Perkins had stopped her rhythmic sweeping of the porch, her broom frozen in midair, her mouth slightly open, as she took in the sight of Margaret Hollis standing there, with nothing but a suitcase and a plastic grocery bag filled with mismatched essentials: a toothbrush, 2 bottles of prescription medication, a phone charger, and a photograph of her daughter, at age 6, that she had snatched from the hallway table on her way out. Margaret did not look back. To look back would be to acknowledge the wreckage, to see the house that had been her fortress and her prison simultaneously. She forced her feet to move the wheels of the suitcase, catching on a crack in the concrete, stuttering forward in the same tentative rhythm she had used to navigate every day of her marriage, careful, measured, afraid to make too much noise. 30 minutes earlier, her life had still been intact. Or rather, the illusion of her life had still been intact, which she now understood was the only version that had ever existed. She had been standing in the kitchen, wiping down the granite countertop after lunch, when Richard walked in from the study with a look on his face she had never seen before. It was not anger, she knew. His anger intimately had catalogued every shade of it over 2 decades, the way a meteorologist catalogues storms. This was something colder, more calculated, like a surgeon preparing to make a cut he had planned for months. He crossed the kitchen without speaking and stopped in front of the antique bureau that had been in his family for 3 generations. A hulking piece of black walnut furniture that Margaret had always thought was merely decorative, a relic of old Virginia money that served no purpose other than to remind visitors that the Hollis family had been somebody long before the suburbs swallowed the farmland. Richard reached behind the bureau's back panel and pulled. A section of wood she had never noticed, had never been meant to notice, swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing a drawer that should not have existed. From it he withdrew a stack of papers thick as a Bible, notarized, stamped, and signed, with a terrifying finality that told her these documents had not been prepared yesterday or last week or even last year. His voice dropped to a whisper, and that was the thing that frightened her most, because Richard Hollis had spent 23 years using volume as a weapon, slamming fist onto the dining table until the silverware jumped, hurling words across rooms like shrapnel. But a whisper from this man was something new. Something that smelled of premeditation and patience, the way a trap smells of oil and rust. "You have nothing here, Margaret, you never did. Sign these final releases or leave with exactly what you're carrying right now." She looked at the papers. She looked at the stranger wearing her husband's face. She understood in that single heartbeat that her life had been a carefully constructed illusion. The house, the land, the bank accounts, the brokerage statements. She had never been allowed to see all of it in his name, structured and restructured over years with the help of lawyers she had never met, accountants whose offices she had never visited. He had spent 2 decades building a cage so seamless that the bird inside could not see the bars. Margaret Hollis was not a naive woman. She had tried to leave before twice. The first time Lily was 6 years old, and Margaret had packed a bag and made it as far as the front door. before Richard intercepted her with a voice that oscillated between threat and tenderness, promising change, promising therapy, promising that the man who had gripped her wrist hard enough to leave fingerprints would never surface again. He had cried that night, and she had believed him, because at 29 she still thought tears were evidence of remorse rather than tools of manipulation. The second time was 11 years later, when Lily was 17. Margaret had saved $900 in a coffee tin hidden behind the cleaning supplies under the bathroom sink. 9 months of skimming grocery money. $5 here, $10 there. The arithmetic of desperation. But Lily had found the tin while looking for paper towels, and the girl had begged her mother to stay, not because she loved her father, but because she could not bear the idea of being forced to choose between two parents in a courtroom. Margaret stayed. The $900 went back into the grocery budget, and the coffee tin went into the trash. Now, at 52, there was no Lily to keep her tethered, no coffee tin to discover, and Richard's whisper carried a weight his shouts never had. She had learned something in 23 years that most people never learn about the architecture of violence. When a man stops yelling and starts whispering, he has moved beyond emotion into strategy, and strategy is where the real danger lives. She signed. Not out of cowardice and not out of ignorance, but because the ice in his eyes told her that staying in this house for one more hour was more dangerous than walking out with nothing. She signed because she had finally learned to read the weather of this man's soul, and what she saw forming on the horizon was a storm she would not survive. Richard Hollis was 55 years old, the son of Douglas Hollis Sr., a man who had run his household the way a foreman runs a mill, with schedules, quotas, and consequences for underperformance. Douglas Sr. had controlled Richard's mother with the same suffocating precision that Richard would later use on Margaret. And the cycle had been so seamless, so generational, that Richard genuinely believed control was the highest form of love. He told himself that managing Margaret's finances was protection, that limiting her friendships was safety, that monitoring her movements was devotion. The lie was so old and so deep that it had calcified into something he mistook for truth. But beneath the surface of Richard's control was a secret Margaret did not yet know, a fissure that had been widening for 5 years. Richard had developed a gambling problem, quiet at first, then consuming the kind that starts with weekend poker games at a friend's lake house and metastasizes into six-figure debts owed to people who do not send polite reminders. His brother, Douglas Jr., ran a brokerage firm in Richmond, and Richard owed him more money than the house was worth. The papers Margaret signed were not simply the end of a marriage. They were the first move in a real estate play that Richard and Douglas had been planning for months, a play that involved a forgotten piece of land in northern Pennsylvania that Margaret had mentioned once years ago in a story about her childhood, that Richard had filed away the way a predator files away the location of water. But Margaret did not know any of this yet. She knew only that the door was closed. The sidewalk was hot, and she was 52 years old with $92 to her name and a phone battery at 38%. She walked to the end of the block and turned the corner, where a massive oak tree stood, its roots buckling the pavement like the earth itself was trying to break free. She had helped plant flowers around its base 12 years ago, back when she still believed that roots could grow anywhere that care and water and patience could make any soil fertile. Now she leaned her back against the rough bark of the trunk, closed her eyes, and took 3 shuddering breaths that tasted like the end of something and the terrifying beginning of something else. She stared at the contact list on her phone for what felt like an eternity, the screen dimming as she hesitated. Her sister June lived 300 miles north in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment outside Allentown, Pennsylvania, with a husband whose back had been failing for years and 3 teenagers who consumed every square inch of available space like gas expanding to fill a container. Months ago, in a rare moment of unguarded honesty over the phone, June had admitted there was not a spare corner left for a houseplant, let alone a human being. Then there was Lily, 27 years old, living in a studio apartment in Richmond with a boyfriend named Jake, whom Margaret had never trusted but never challenged, because challenging Jake meant challenging Lily. and challenging Lily meant risking the only relationship she had left. Lily was a girl who lived on the knife's edge of her own anxiety, perpetually one missed paycheck from catastrophe, one argument from homelessness. She waited tables at a restaurant where the tips were inconsistent, and the manager was the kind of man who scheduled shifts as punishment. Her studio was the size of a generous walk-in closet. Her refrigerator contained condiments and hope. Margaret pressed Lily's name on the screen. The phone rang 3 times before her daughter picked up. Breathless, distracted, the ambient roar of a restaurant kitchen bleeding through the speaker. "Mom, what's up? I'm right in the middle of a shift." Margaret heard her own voice emerge, small and brittle like dry leaves crumbling under a boot. "Your father put me out, Lily." A long, heavy silence colonized the line, the kind of silence that carries the weight of 1,000 questions nobody has the courage to ask. "What do you mean he put you out? Like what, Mom? I don't understand." Margaret closed her eyes harder, pressing her skull against the oak bark until the roughness became a kind of anchor. "I mean, I'm standing on the sidewalk with a suitcase and a stack of legal papers. The house was never mine. None of it was. I have nowhere to go." Another silence longer, punctuated by the muffled clatter of plates and the distant bark of a line cook calling orders. When Lily spoke again, her voice had the frantic quality of someone trying to solve an equation with too many variables and not enough time. "Mom, I'm at work. I can't. Can I call you back later this evening?" "Yes, you can call me." The call came 2 hours later. But it was not the lifeline Margaret had spent those 2 hours constructing in her imagination. Lily's voice was low, hurried, and thick with a guilt she tried to camouflage with practicality. Her rent was behind. Jake had lost his overtime hours. The studio barely had room for a second chair, much less a second person. There was no malice in Lily's voice, only the particular helplessness of a young woman who had inherited her mother's talent for endurance, but not her mother's willingness to sacrifice comfort for someone else's survival. Then Lily said the words that landed like a slap delivered with an open palm and a closed heart. "You'll be okay, Mom. You always find a way. You're the strongest person I know." Margaret thanked her daughter and pressed the red button and stared at the darkened screen. She sat beneath the oak tree in the fading light and wondered when exactly being strong had stopped. Being a character trait and become a biological mandate, something the world demanded of her. The way it demands that the heart keep beating or the lungs keep expanding. Not as a choice, but as a condition of existence. She had spent 23 years teaching Lily by example. Endure, don't complain, don't ask for help, carry the weight alone. And now her daughter had handed that lesson back to her like a mirror, and the reflection was unbearable. The first night was spent in a roadside motel near the interstate, the kind of establishment that exists in the margins of American geography, visible from the highway, but invisible to anyone who does not need it. The walls were the color of yellow mustard. The air carried the layered archaeology of industrial lemon cleaner, stale cigarette smoke, and the faint ghost of someone else's perfume trapped in the curtains. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and counted the things. She still owned a suitcase, a plastic bag, a maiden name she had not used in 23 years, and a memory of a farmhouse on a hill that she had spent her adult life trying to forget. The $92 was evaporating. The motel had cost $47 for the night, and she had spent another $6 on a sandwich from the vending machine that tasted like cardboard and regret. That left $39 between her and the particular kind of American poverty that has no safety net, no grace period, and no hotline that connects you to someone who actually has the power to help. That night, she dreamed of her father. Henry Dunbar stood at the iron gate of the farm in northern Pennsylvania wearing the same flannel shirt he had worn every autumn Saturday, for as long as she could remember, his hands at his sides, his face unreadable. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, then turned and walked back toward the house, disappearing around the bend in the overgrown path. She woke at 3 in the morning. her skin cold and damp, and realized it was not a dream, but a memory the last time she had seen her father alive standing at that exact gate, in that exact posture, as though he had been waiting for someone to come up the road. She had been visiting for the weekend, and when she left on Sunday afternoon, she had glanced in the rearview mirror and seen him still standing there, getting smaller and smaller, until the road curved and he vanished. 7 months later, he was dead. A heart attack alone on the kitchen floor of the farmhouse, found 3 days later by a postal worker who noticed the mail accumulating. Margaret had not been there. She had been in Virginia ironing Richard's shirts. June called the next morning. Her voice arrived sharp and bright with indignation, the way a blade arrives, fast, purposeful, and surprisingly comforting when you realize it is pointed at someone else. I heard from Lily, and then I called that miserable man, though I didn't get past his voicemail before I started yelling into the machine like a crazy person. I swear to God, Margaret. June, slow down. Listen, I've been thinking all night. We don't have room here. You know, Tom's back and the kids are everywhere. But there's one thing. June's voice shifted, dropping into a register Margaret recognized as her sister's planning mode, the tone she used when she was assembling a solution from spare parts. Do you remember Dad's old place, the Dunbar farm up in the hills? Margaret went quiet. The image rose from the silt of memory, like something dredged from a river bottom. A farmhouse on a ridge in northern Pennsylvania, surrounded by 18 acres of stubborn, rocky earth that had resisted every attempt at cultivation her father had ever made. Henry Dunbar had purchased the property in 1974 with money he never explained, and he had spent the next 30 years working it with his hands while the world modernized around him. He died in 2010, leaving the two sisters a forgotten patch of land about 40 miles outside Scranton that neither of them had visited since the funeral. That place has been empty for over a decade, June. The last time we were there was to bury Dad. It was falling apart then. June did not miss a beat. She was the older sister, the one who had inherited their mother's talent for forward motion, and she deployed it now with the efficiency of a general redirecting troops. It's a roof, Margaret. It's ugly, it's old, and it probably needs 1,000 repairs, but it's half yours. The taxes have been paid out of the estate account all these years, and the deed is sitting in my drawer. Tom went up there about 2 years ago to check the fence lines and said the structure was still standing. Windows might be gone, but the bones are good. Tom Caldwell was June's husband, a man of few words and chronic back pain, who expressed affection through acts of quiet maintenance, checking fence lines, changing oil, tightening loose screws on cabinet doors. If Tom said the bones were good, the bones were good. Margaret looked at the mustard-colored wall. She thought about the farm, a place of hard chores and cold winters of calloused hands and early mornings of a father who communicated through silence and labor rather than language. She had fled that life at 22, married Richard at 29. And spent the intervening decades building an identity as far from dirt and manual work as she could get. The farm was the ghost of everything she had tried to outrun, but it was also the only piece of the world that Richard's pen had not touched. She told June she would go, but even as she said the words, she felt the old anger stir not at Richard, not at Lily, but at Henry Dunbar himself. Her father had been a man so deeply silent that she had spent years interpreting his quietness as indifference. When she had brought Richard home for the first time, her father had shaken his hand and said nothing. When she announced the engagement, he had nodded. On the morning of the wedding, he drove her to the church in his pickup truck, the cab smelling of diesel and pine, and the silence between them stretched for 12 miles of Pennsylvania back road, until he pulled into the church parking lot and cut the engine. You sure about this boy, Maggie? 5 words, the first and last time he would ever question her choice. She had looked at him, this weathered, unreadable man who trusted soil more than language, and answered with the confidence of a 29-year-old woman who believed she understood love. Yes, Daddy. He nodded, got out, opened her door, walked her up the aisle, never mentioned Richard again. 23 years later, Standing in a motel room with $39 and a dead phone, Margaret wanted to scream at the memory. Why didn't you say more? Why didn't you grab my arm and tell me not to walk through that door? Why didn't you fight for me just once the way you fought for every stubborn acre of that useless farm? But she knew the answer, even as she formed the question, and the answer made the anger worse, because it was true. If he had spoken, she would not have listened. At 29, drunk on the illusion of love, she would have dismissed him as an old farmer who did not understand the modern world. He knew that. So he asked one question, accepted her answer, and spent the rest of his life preparing for the day she would need a place to fall. The Greyhound bus departed from a station in Northern Virginia at 6:15 in the morning, pulling onto the interstate with the slow hydraulic groan of something too large to be graceful. Margaret sat in a window seat near the back, her suitcase wedged into the overhead rack, her plastic bag on her lap, and watched the landscape transform itself mile by mile as Virginia's green manicured suburbs gave way to the raw, unpolished geography of Maryland and then Pennsylvania. The rolling farmland flattened, then crumpled the earth, pushing upward into the Appalachian foothills, like a body turning in restless sleep. The trees changed the ornamental maples and dogwoods of Virginia, replaced by scrub oak and hemlock, the vegetation growing wilder and less apologetic with every mile north. She felt a strange sense of being stripped, as though the bus were not simply carrying her through geography, but peeling away the layers of identity she had accumulated over 2 decades. The wife was gone, signed away on a kitchen counter. The suburban homeowner was gone, locked behind a door that would never reopen. Even the mother felt tenuous, reduced to a voice on the phone that a 27-year-old could dismiss with a platitude about strength. What remained was something she had not been in 23 years. Margaret Dunbar, a farmer's daughter from the hills of Pennsylvania, a girl who had once known how to coax water from a hand pump and split kindling in the cold. The woman in the seat beside her held a sleeping infant against her chest, the baby's face pressed into the soft valley between shoulder and neck. She glanced at Margaret's suitcase and plastic bag with the casual, non-judgmental curiosity of someone who had seen people in transit before. "You visiting family up north?" Margaret considered the question longer than it deserved. Something like that. She arrived in the town of Clear Creek on a Wednesday afternoon, 7 hours after departure, under a sky that had turned the color of wet slate. Clear Creek was not a town in any metropolitan sense. It was a cluster of buildings arranged along a 2-lane road like vertebrae along a spine. A general store, a post office that shared a wall with a barber shop, a church with a steeple that leaned slightly east, and a gas station whose pumps looked old enough to have opinions. The air was different here, thinner, sharper, carrying the mineral scent of limestone and the green breath of forests that had never been trimmed for aesthetics. A local taxi driver, a man with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same rock as the mountains, drove her the final 5 miles out to the old Dunbar property. He kept glancing at a suitcase in the rearview mirror. And when she asked him to stop at the rusted iron gate, he turned around fully, his expression hovering between concern and something older, something that might have been recognition. "You sure about this, ma'am? There hasn't been a soul out here in years. Nearest neighbor is a good 3 miles back down the road." Margaret met his eyes. She noticed they were the same pale gray as her father's, the color of people who have spent generations squinting into the wind off these ridges. She nodded, her jaw set in a line that surprised even her. "I'm sure. Thank you." The gate groaned when she pushed it open, a high-pitched metallic protest that echoed through the silent valley, like the cry of something that had been waiting a long time to be disturbed. The hinges were stiff with rust, and she had to lean her full weight into the iron before it surrendered, swinging inward with a reluctant shudder. Beyond the gate, a dirt drive stretched upward through a corridor of overgrown brush, blackberry canes, and goldenrod, and the skeletal remains of wildflowers that had bloomed and died without an audience for 14 years. She walked the final half mile up the drive, the wheels of a suitcase clicking against stones in a rhythm that sounded like a metronome counting down to something she could not name. The brush pressed in on both sides' branches, reaching across the path like arms trying to hold her back or pull her forward, she could not tell which. The air grew cooler as the elevation increased, and by the time the house came into view around a bend in the overgrown path, the temperature had dropped enough that she could see her breath forming small temporary ghosts in front of her face. She stopped dead. It was worse than she remembered, and she had remembered it as bad. A shutter hung from a single hinge, dangling at an angle that made it look like a broken jaw. The front porch sagged in the middle, the boards bowing downward under their own weight, like an old dog too tired to stand but too stubborn to lie down completely. The paint, which had once been white, had peeled away in long curling strips that hung from the clapboard like dead skin. Two of the front windows were dark empty sockets, the glass either shattered by winter storms or simply surrendered to time. A section of the roof on the east side showed bare rafters, where shingles had been torn away, and a colony of something green and persistent had taken up residence along the foundation. But the chimney still stood, straight, vertical, unapologetic, built from the same limestone that formed the spine of the ridge behind the house. It rose above the roofline like a finger pointed at the sky, and in its refusal to crumble, Margaret saw her father more clearly than she had seen him in 14 years, stubborn, silent, and standing. Margaret cried. For the first time since the door clicked shut in Virginia, she cried. Not for the house she had lost, that polished granite-countered prison, with its perfect lawn and its hidden drawer, but for the exhaustion of being the woman who always finds a way. She cried for 23 years spent building a life on shifting sand, only to discover that her father had left her a foundation of solid stone, and she had been too proud, too determined to escape her origins to notice. She cried because she was 52 years old, standing in a field of dead grass with $39, and the only thing on earth that belonged to her was a house that was losing a fight with gravity. But she also cried because for the first time in 23 years, nobody was watching. Nobody was waiting for her to wipe her face and soldier forward. Nobody was depending on her strength. She was alone in a way that was both devastating and liberating, the way an empty room is both a void and a canvas. The tears were hers, the silence was hers, and the permission to fall apart even briefly was a gift that could only come from absolute solitude. She gave herself 4 minutes, then she wiped her face with the back of her hand. The same gesture her father used to make after coming in from a day of clearing brush, and stepped onto the porch. The boards protested but held. The front door was not locked. The wood had swollen so severely in the humidity that it was jammed into the frame like a fist pushed into a glove, 2 sizes too small. She threw her shoulder against it once, then again, and on the second impact it burst open with a sound like a gasp. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust, old paper, and the permanent dampness of a roof that had surrendered at least one layer of defense to the last winter storm. The floorboards creaked under her weight, but did not give the same hemlock planks her father had laid 40 years ago, warped and weathered, but structurally honest in a way that expensive materials rarely are. In the kitchen, she found the old cast-iron stove, its surface furred with rust, but its body intact, and beside the sink, a hand pump whose handle was stiff with disuse. She gripped it with both hands and worked it up and down once, twice, a dozen times, her arms burning with the effort, and on the 13th stroke, a stream of water burst from the spout, cold and clear and tasting of iron and limestone, and the deep patience of a mountain that had been holding this water for her without knowing when she would come to claim it. The cistern was still full. The mountain had been kinder to her than her own family. She spent the remainder of that first evening in a whirlwind of basic survival, her body remembering movements her mind had tried to forget. She found a broom in the pantry, the same broom she realized with a start that her father had used, and swept years of cobwebs and dead insects from the main bedroom. The iron bed frame stood in the corner, stripped of its mattress long ago, the springs exposed like the ribs of an animal left too long in the sun. She folded her winter coat into a makeshift pillow and layered her spare clothes across the springs to create a thin buffer between her body and the metal. For dinner, She ate a tin of sardines and some crackers purchased at the bus station, washed down with water from the pump that tasted like the inside of a mine shaft. As the sun dropped below the ridge, the valley filled with a darkness so complete it seemed to have texture, a velvet weight that pressed against the windows and swallowed the tree line and the fence posts and the outline of the mountains, until the only things left in the world were this room, this bed, and the sound of her own breathing. The stars appeared, more of them than she had ever seen in Virginia, so many that the sky looked damaged, punctured by 1,000 points of cold white light. The silence was absolute, no traffic, no television, no neighbors, no Richard. It was the silence of a place that existed before language, and Margaret lay on her iron bed and let it fill her, the way water fills a vessel that has been empty for a long time. By the fourth day, her hands were blistered, and her back carried a dull, constant ache that radiated from her lower spine to the base of her skull. But the house was beginning to remember what it meant to be inhabited. She had scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees until the linoleum revealed its original pattern, pale blue, the color her mother had chosen in 1976, the year Margaret turned 2. She had sealed the broken parlor window with heavy plastic sheeting and duct tape, a temporary fix that let in light while keeping out the wind that came down off the ridge in the evenings, carrying the scent of pine and something older, something mineral and permanent. She was learning the rhythms of the property the way a musician learns a new instrument, by feel, by repetition, by the slow accumulation of intimacy with a thing that does not yield its secrets quickly. She learned that the hand pump needed 12 strokes in the morning, but only 8 in the afternoon when the water table was higher. She learned that the east-facing bedroom stayed warm until noon, but turned cold by 2. She learned that the porch steps were safest on the left side where the wood was thicker, and that the third step from the top should be avoided entirely. On the afternoon of the fourth day, she took an old machete from the tool shed, its blade spotted with rust but still holding an edge, and walked to the back of the property to clear the waist-high weeds that were choking the path to the creek. The work was hard and rhythmic, the blade swinging in arcs that sent cut grass flying in green sprays. And for the first time since Virginia, she felt something that was not grief or anger or fear. She felt useful. She felt competent. She felt the particular satisfaction that comes from imposing order on chaos, with nothing but a sharp edge and the willingness to swing. She was nearly to the fence line when she noticed it. A patch of ground that looked different from the rest. A depression about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, where the grass grew thin and reluctant. The soil beneath it darker than the surrounding clay, almost black, as though something had been buried there, and the earth had been stained by the act of concealment. The shape was too regular, too deliberate to be natural. Not a collapsed burrow, not a drainage ditch. It looked like a trench that had been dug, filled, and then abandoned to the slow erasure of seasons. Margaret stood over it for a long time, the machete resting against her thigh. Her breathing slowed. She told herself it was probably an old irrigation attempt. Her father had tried dozens of failed agricultural projects over the years, each one abandoned with the quiet resignation of a man who understood that this land was never going to cooperate with conventional farming. She continued toward the creek. But 20 yards further, partially obscured by a thicket of blackberry brambles, so dense it looked intentional, she stumbled upon something else. A low concrete structure, no more than a foot above the ground, its surface covered in a thick layer of moss that had been accumulating for years. A heavy lid sat on top, fitted precisely into a lip that had been poured with the kind of care that suggests permanence, not a temporary solution, but a deliberate installation built to last beyond the lifetime of the man who built it. She tapped the lid with the handle of the machete. The sound that returned was a deep, hollow resonance that traveled through the concrete and into the ground beneath her boots, vibrating up through her ankles and into her knees. Whatever was beneath this lid, the space was not small, and it was not solid. That night, sleep refused to come. She lay on the iron bed staring at the ceiling where a water stain had created a shape that looked like a map of no particular country, and thought about her father. Henry Dunbar had been a man who trusted the earth the way other men trust contracts, completely specifically, and with the understanding that the terms were non-negotiable. He had spent weeks at a time on this farm while Margaret and June were children, always returning home with the same explanation: mending fences, checking soil, clearing brush, and the same evidence dirt under his fingernails, and a quiet satisfaction in his eyes that neither daughter could decode. He had never made the farm profitable in any conventional sense. No crops survived the rocky soil. No livestock thrived on the sparse grazing. Yet somehow money appeared when it was needed. A new roof in 1988, June's college tuition in 1990. A reliable used car for Margaret's 16th birthday. When pressed about the source, Henry would offer a vague reference to savings or side work, and the explanation was always just plausible enough to prevent further questioning. He was a man who kept his secrets the way the mountain kept its limestone, buried deep, invisible from the surface, and available only to those who knew where to dig. Margaret lay on the iron springs and realized she did not know the history of this land at all. She knew only the stories her father had chosen to tell, and tonight, for the first time, she understood that the stories he had chosen to withhold might be the ones that mattered most. The old anger flickered, the same anger she had felt at June's suggestion of the farm. "Why didn't you tell me, Dad? Why did you let me walk into that marriage, into that house, into that life when you had this place, this land, this secret? You were so busy protecting. If you loved me, why was your love always so quiet?" But the anger was softer now, blunted by exhaustion and the 4 days of labor that had reconnected her hands to the earth her father had worked. And somewhere beneath the anger, in a place she was not ready to examine yet, was the beginning of a question she would not be able to answer until she opened the concrete lid, the question of whether silence can be its own form of devotion, and whether a man who buries something in the ground for his daughter is saying more than a man who speaks 1,000 words. She walked 3 miles to town on the morning of the 5th day, her boots crunching against the gravel shoulder of a road that had not seen fresh asphalt in a decade. The air carried the clean mineral edge of early autumn in the Appalachian foothills, cool enough to sharpen the senses, warm enough to make the walk bearable. Wildflowers she could not name lined the ditches on both sides, their colors fading into the brown and gold of a season preparing to surrender. She passed a collapsed barn whose roof had caved inward, forming a wooden valley, where ferns now grew in the diffused light. She passed a rusted mailbox standing at the end of a driveway that led nowhere, the house it once served having vanished, completely consumed by time and vegetation, and the particular American amnesia that swallows rural places whole. Clear Creek General Store occupied a rambling wooden building at the intersection of the two-lane road and a county route that meandered north towards Scranton. It served simultaneously as the town's post office, grocery, hardware supplier, and unofficial clearinghouse for every piece of information that moved through the valley. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Brewers General, established 1961," in letters that had been white once and were now the color of old bone. The bell above the door chimed when Margaret entered, and the man behind the counter looked up from a crate of apples with the practiced alertness of someone who had been cataloging the movements of this valley for half a century. Old Man Brewer existed in an age bracket that had stopped advancing somewhere deep in his 70s, his face a topographical map of wrinkles and sun damage. His eyes magnified behind thick spectacles into something that resembled the lenses of a microscope. He was the kind of man who knew not only what you came in to buy, but why you came in to buy it. And he dispensed both goods and judgment from behind a counter, worn smooth by 60 years of elbows. Margaret selected her essentials with the careful economy of a woman operating on finite resources. 5 pounds of flour, a tin of ground coffee, a box of 16-penny nails, a roll of duct tape, a bar of soap. She carried them to the counter and arranged them in a line, and as Brewer rang each item on a register so old it had mechanical keys, she asked the question that had kept her awake for 2 consecutive nights. "Mr. Brewer, did you know my father, Henry Dunbar?" Brewer's hands paused over the coffee tin, suspending it between the counter and the bag. His magnified eyes found hers and held them with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen on a slide. Henry Dunbar. The name emerged from Brewer's mouth with a reverence that bordered on geological, as though he were naming a rock formation or a watershed. Lord, yes, quietest man this county ever produced. Came into this store every Saturday morning for 30 years. 7:15 sharp, never a minute late, never a minute early. Bought the same things, coffee, nails, kerosene in winter. Never said more than 20 words at a stretch. But every one of those words you could take to the bank and cash. You, his daughter, the one who went down south. Margaret felt a strange prickle at the base of her skull, something between pride and grief. I am. I've moved back into the old place. Brewer leaned forward, his elbows finding their worn grooves on the counter. The old place. Henry loved that land. Used to say it had more layers than an onion. You looking to farm it? She explained that she was just trying to make the house livable and mentioned almost as an afterthought the concrete structure she had found near the creek. The shift in Brewer's expression was immediate, his eyebrows climbing his forehead like two gray caterpillars startled by light. A concrete box out by the creek. His voice dropped half a register. Sounds like one of Henry's projects. He was always burying things. Didn't trust the government, didn't trust the banks, especially after the old Carbondale mill shut down, and half the county lost their savings overnight. Henry watched that happen and decided the earth was the only vault that couldn't be foreclosed on. Brewer bagged her items with the deliberate pace of a man who understood that information like coffee should be dispensed in measured portions. Before she reached the door, he leaned across the counter one final time. If you need help with heavy work, there's a young man named Nathan Sutter. Veteran, did 2 tours overseas, came back different, the way they all come back different. Lives in a trailer off Route 9. Good with tools, strong as a draft horse, and he keeps his mouth shut, which around here is worth more than muscle. I'll send him your way tomorrow if you want. Margaret agreed, understanding with the pragmatism of a woman who had spent 4 days trying to move a world that would not budge, that she could not open that concrete lid alone. Nathan Sutter arrived at 7 the following morning in a pickup truck that appeared to be held together by rust and stubbornness, the bed dented in 4 places. The passenger door a different shade of blue than the rest of the body. The engine producing a sound that suggested ongoing negotiation between functional and terminal. He stepped out and stood by the truck for a moment, surveying the property with the quiet, comprehensive gaze of someone trained to assess terrain before entering it. He was 30, with the broad shoulders and lean waist of a man whose muscle had been built through labor rather than vanity. His face was young, but his eyes were not. They carried the specific gravity of someone who had seen things that could not be unseen. A weight that expressed itself not as sadness, but as a permanent vigilance, a refusal to be surprised by anything the world might produce. He brought his own tools, a crowbar, a heavy-duty shovel, a sledgehammer arranged in the truck bed, with the orderly precision of surgical instruments. They walked to the back of the property without speaking. The only sound the crunch of dry grass beneath their boots and the distant complaint of a crow somewhere in the tree line. Margaret noticed that Nate walked slightly behind her and to the left, maintaining a sight line to both the path ahead and the tree cover on either side, and she recognized the habit for what it was: a man who had spent years walking through landscapes where the quiet places were the most dangerous. When they reached the concrete structure, Nate crouched beside it and ran his hand along the edge of the lid, his fingers reading the surface the way a blind man reads text. High-grade concrete, ma'am. His voice was low, unhurried, and carried the flat vowels of northeastern Pennsylvania. Poured with rebar reinforcement, you can see the grid pattern on the underside of the lip. Whoever built this wasn't mixing bags in a wheelbarrow. This was engineered, built to outlast the man who poured it. He spent the next hour clearing the brambles with a machete he produced from the truck, then worked the crowbar into the seam between lid and base, his body leveraging angles with the economy of someone who understood physics not as theory, but as daily practice. Margaret watched with an escalating tightness in her chest, her breath shortening with each inch the lid surrendered. The stone-on-stone grinding filled the valley with a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, as though the mountain were clearing its throat after a long silence. The lid shifted. Nate repositioned his legs, braced and heaved. The slab slid sideways, revealing a darkness that exhaled, not the fetid breath of decomposition, but a cool, dry exhalation of preserved air, old metal, and the deep mineral patience of undisturbed earth. Nate shone a flashlight into the opening. The beam cut through the darkness and found its targets, a large galvanized metal box roughly the size of a military footlocker, its surface spotted with age but structurally sound, and beside it two long cylinders wrapped tightly in thick yellowed plastic that had been sealed with wax at both ends. "You want me to pull them out?" His voice had dropped to nearly a whisper, not from fear, but from the instinctive recognition that some moments require a human voice to make itself small. Margaret nodded, her heart slamming against her ribs with a force she could feel in her fingertips. Nate reached down and lifted the metal box first, his arms straining under a weight that announced itself through the dull clinking of solid objects shifting inside. Then the cylinders, lighter but awkward, their plastic wrapping crackling in the morning air. They carried everything to the kitchen table. Sunlight poured through the plastic-covered window and fell across the metal box in a bright rectangle that illuminated every scratch and dent on its surface, every year of its burial made visible in the patina of oxidation. Nate stepped back toward the door, his hands finding his pockets. "This looks private, ma'am. I'll be on the porch." She heard his boots on the boards, then the creak of the porch railing as he leaned against it, and then she was alone with whatever her father had buried in the ground and waited 14 years for her to find. The latches on the metal box were rusted into their housings, fused by time and moisture into a single corroded mass. She worked a kitchen knife under the first one, prying with a patience that cost her more than the effort warranted. Because every second of delay was a second, she was still the woman who did not know what was inside. And part of her, the part that had signed Richard's papers without reading them. The part that had spent 23 years not looking in drawers she was not invited to open, wanted to remain in that ignorance a little longer. The latch snapped free, then the second. She lifted the lid. The first thing she saw was money. Not the crisp mechanical bills that come from a bank, but old currency 20s and 50s. Their colors faded to the muted palette of autumn leaves bundled with twine in stacks that had been compressed by the weight of years and the lid above them. She did not count it immediately, but her hands moving through the stacks with the trembling precision of an archaeologist handling artifacts estimated thousands. Not a fortune by the standards of the world she had just left, but a reservoir enough to breathe, enough to buy time, enough to transform $39 of desperation into something that resembled a margin. Beneath the money lay a leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked and darkened by age, and a thick envelope bearing her name in handwriting she would have recognized in a crowd of 10,000 documents. The tall leaning letters of a man who had spent more time holding a plow handle than a pen, each character formed with the deliberate effort of someone for whom writing was labor, not expression. She picked up the envelope. The paper felt heavy, weighted not by the number of pages inside, but by 14 years of silence, 14 years during which this letter had waited in the darkness beneath the earth for the daughter who might never come. She opened it. She began to read. And the kitchen, the cracked linoleum, the rusted stove, the plastic-covered window dissolved around her as the voice of Henry Dunbar rose from the page like water from a well. "Margaret, if you're reading this, it means the world outside hasn't been as kind to you as I hoped it would be. I always knew you'd be the one to come back. June has the city in her blood, but you always understood the silence of the hills." She stopped, read the sentences again, a third time. The words, "I always knew you'd be the one to come back," detonated somewhere behind her sternum, because they meant he had seen it. Seen the trajectory of her life, seen the marriage for what it was, seen the ending before the middle had even begun, and had chosen not to intervene. The anger from the motel room returned sharper now, more specific, aimed at a dead man who could not defend himself. She read on. I have a secret to tell you, one I couldn't even tell your mother. God rest her soul. When I bought this farm in 1974, I paid for 18 acres. But 3 years later, I had a man named Old Walt do a private survey because the fence lines didn't match the mountain spine. We found out the deed was wrong. There are 8 extra acres on the other side of the creek hidden behind the ridge. I never recorded it. I was afraid the county would tax me out of existence or the neighbors would start a feud. Margaret's breath caught. 8 acres, a piece of land that existed in reality but not on paper, hidden by topography and protected by her father's silence. But there's more. Walt was an old miner before he was a surveyor. He told me the soil on those 8 acres was different. He called it white gold. It's high-grade calcite, Margaret. Limestone so pure it could be used for the finest glass or the toughest cement. I didn't have the money or the heart to tear the mountain open while I was alive. And I didn't want the big companies coming in and ruining the peace of this valley. But I saved every penny I could and put it in that box along with the real survey maps and the mineral reports Walt did for me. She was crying now, but the tears were complex, layered with anger and awe, and the particular devastation of understanding too late. He had known about the limestone for decades. He had sat on a fortune not out of ignorance but out of principle, choosing the silence of the valley over the machinery of extraction, choosing to protect the land even from his own financial need. And he had funded their lives, the new roof, June's tuition, every unexplained windfall, by selling small loads of high-grade stone to local contractors doing the work by hand alone, keeping the secret the way the mountain kept the calcite deep, quiet, and safe. If you ever find yourself with your back against the wall, use this. Don't let the sharks take it for nothing. This land is your shield. Love, Dad. She set the letter down on the table and sat without moving for a long time, her hands flat on the wood, her eyes unfocused. The anger was still there, a hard knot beneath her breastbone that would take months to fully dissolve. But wrapped around it now was something she had not expected, a recognition that changed the shape of every memory she had of her father. He had not been silent because he was indifferent. He had been silent because he understood something about love that she was only now learning, that sometimes the deepest act of devotion is to prepare for a disaster you hope will never come, and to do it so quietly that the person you are protecting never feels the weight of your worry. He had asked her one question at the church door. She had answered. He had nodded. And then he had gone home and poured concrete. She unwrapped the 2 cylinders with hands that had stopped trembling, replaced now by a steadiness that felt borrowed from the man who had buried them. Inside, detailed topographical maps drawn in pencil and ink on heavy drafting paper, showing the true boundaries of the Dunbar farm, not 18 acres but 26, the additional 8, hidden behind the ridge on the far side of the creek, invisible from the road and from every official survey ever filed with the county. Alongside the maps, chemical analysis sheets from a laboratory in Scranton, dated 1982, confirming the presence of high-purity calcite deposits across the hidden acreage. The numbers meant nothing to Margaret in isolation, but the word exceptional appeared 3 times in the geologist's notes, underlined each time, with the careful emphasis of a scientist who understood he was documenting something rare. She called June that evening. The conversation lasted 2 hours, most of it conducted in the breathless, overlapping cadences of 2 sisters processing a revelation that restructured the geography of their childhood. June wept. Margaret described the money, the letter, the maps, the mineral reports, and with each detail, June's weeping shifted from grief to something more volatile, a mixture of sorrow and vindication, and the particular fury of a woman who had spent 40 years believing her father was merely frugal, when in fact he had been strategic. June and Tom arrived 48 hours later in a sedan that Tom drove with the careful patience of a man whose back could not tolerate potholes. When Tom saw the maps spread across the kitchen table, weighted down at the corners with coffee mugs and canned goods, he lowered himself into a chair and spent 3 hours studying them without speaking. his index finger tracing the contour lines the way a man traces the veins on the back of his wife's hand, with intimacy, with reverence, with the growing understanding that what he was touching was more valuable than anything he had ever held. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the gravity of a man who understood that information once released cannot be recalled. If these reports are even half accurate, those 8 acres are worth more than the rest of the county combined. But your father was right. The moment this gets out, the sharks will circle. We need to move quietly. They agreed on a plan. Margaret would use a portion of the cash to hire a geologist from the state university to verify the mineral reports and a lawyer from Scranton, a man named Hargrove, who specialized in mineral rights and land disputes, to begin the legal process of correcting the deed and filing the mineral claim. Everything would be done through proper channels, documented, time-stamped, and armored against the kind of challenges that men with money and lawyers would inevitably bring. That night, after June and Tom had fallen asleep in the spare bedroom on an air mattress that Tom's back would punish him for in the morning, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table and called Lily. Not to ask for help, not to deliver news, but because something in her had shifted, a tectonic realignment that made her voice sound different even to her own ears, and she wanted her daughter to hear it. She told Lily about the farm, about the repairs, about the water that came up cold and clean from a pump that had been waiting for someone to use it. She did not mention the money or the mineral reports. That information was not ready to be shared. But she talked about the land and the house and the silence of the valley, until Lily interrupted with a voice that sounded younger than 27, younger than the girl who had told her mother to be strong. "Mom, I'm sorry. About what I said, you always find a way." That was a terrible thing to say to someone who was asking for help. Margaret closed her eyes. This was the first time Lily had ever walked back those words. "I want to send you something. It's not much, $200. Jake doesn't know." Margaret's first instinct was to refuse. She had spent 23 years declining assistance, deflecting concern, insisting on self-sufficiency, as though accepting help were a form of moral failure. But in that kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a father who had spent decades silently helping her, without her knowledge, she understood that allowing someone to give was its own act of love, that the hand extended and the hand that receives are both performing the same gesture, just from different directions. "Thank you, Lily. That means more than you know." The call ended. Margaret sat in the dark kitchen and felt something reknit itself in the space between her chest and her throat, not healed, not whole, but connected in a way it had not been since the door closed in Virginia. And in the weeks that followed, Lily called every Sunday evening, and the $200 arrived again the next month. And then the month after that, each envelope a small quiet act of penance that neither mother nor daughter named aloud, but both understood. 14 days after the box was opened, the geologist arrived, took samples, and departed with a professional restraint that could not fully conceal his excitement. Hargrove reviewed the documents, asked pointed questions, and began drafting the corrected deed with the methodical patience of a man who understood that legal precision was the only weapon that worked against institutional power. The farm continued its slow transformation. Margaret and Nate working in parallel, clearing brush, replacing boards, patching the roof with salvaged materials, their conversations sparse and functional. The companionship of two people who communicated through shared labor rather than shared language. Then the black SUV appeared. It came up the dirt drive on a Tuesday afternoon, its polished surface reflecting the surrounding forest in dark, distorted panels, looking as alien in this landscape as a limousine in a cornfield. A man stepped out, mid-40s, suit cut to precision, shoes that had never touched unpaved ground, a smile calibrated to project warmth while communicating none. He introduced himself as Greg Felton, representing Ridgeline Capital Group. "We've been doing some regional scouting, Mrs. Hollis." The use of her married name was deliberate. A small blade slipped between ribs to remind her of who she had been and how recently she had been it. "We noticed this property has been dormant for quite some time. We'd like to offer you $200,000 for the entire 18 acres. Cash, no questions, no complications. Margaret looked at Greg Felton. She looked at his shoes. She looked at the SUV idling behind him with its engine running, as though the vehicle itself expected the transaction to be brief. Then she looked past him at the farmhouse, the patched roof, the new boards on the porch, the chimney standing straight against the afternoon sky. The property isn't for sale, and my name is Margaret Dunbar. Felton's smile performed a subtle contraction, narrowing from performance to calculation. We're aware of your situation, Margaret. The divorce, the financial constraints. This is a generous offer for land in this condition, a genuine lifeline. If you choose not to accept, we may have to examine certain irregularities in your father's original deed. Old surveys, boundary disputes, the kind of thing that can tie a property up in litigation for a decade. It would be a real shame. He left a business card on the porch railing and drove away, the SUV's tires crunching down the dirt drive with the unhurried confidence of someone who expected to return. Margaret stood on the porch and watched until the vehicle disappeared around the bend. Her hands were shaking. $200,000. It was more money than she had ever controlled, more than Richard had ever let her see on a statement, more than enough to buy a small apartment somewhere quiet and live out her years in modest anonymity. She could take it. Walk away from the farm, from the legal fight that was gathering on the horizon, from the memory of a father whose silence had left her exposed to exactly this kind of predator. For 10 minutes she sat on the porch steps and let the temptation work through her body, the way a fever works, hot, persuasive, offering the false comfort of surrender. The land doesn't owe me anything. Dad doesn't owe me anything. I could just take the money and disappear. Then she looked down at her hands, blistered, calloused, cracked along the knuckles where the machete handle had worn through the skin. These were not the hands of the woman who had signed Richard's papers. These were the hands of a woman who had spent 2 weeks rebuilding a house from the inside out, who had pumped water from stone, who had scraped a kitchen floor until the color came back. These were the hands of Henry Dunbar's daughter. She left Felton's card on the railing where the wind could take it. That night, she woke to light where there should have been none. Through the bedroom window, past the plastic sheeting, she caught the intermittent flash of a beam moving along the fence line near the creek. Not the steady glow of an animal's eye shine, but the directed, purposeful sweep of a flashlight wielded by someone who knew what they were looking for. She called Nate. He arrived in 19 minutes, which meant he had driven the 5 miles from his trailer in the dark at a speed that suggested he had been expecting this call. He carried a shotgun broken open over his forearm and a flashlight that could illuminate the far side of a football field. They found no one. But the evidence was undeniable: fresh boot prints in the soft soil near the creek bank. The tread pattern of expensive hiking boots, not the worn rubber soles of a local hunter. And driven into the ground at regular intervals along the ridgeline, 6 orange survey stakes, the kind used by professional land assessors. Each one a small flag planted in territory that did not belong to whoever planted it. Nate pulled the stakes out of the ground one by one and carried them back to the porch, where he laid them in a row on the boards like evidence at a crime scene. His face was unreadable in the porch light, but his voice carried a quality Margaret had not heard before. Controlled, operational, stripped of all civilian softness. I've seen this playbook before, ma'am. Different landscapes, same mechanics. When somebody wants what you have, they start with offers. When you refuse, they send people in the dark to establish a foothold. Then they escalate. You need to decide right now, fight or fold. Margaret looked at the orange stakes arranged on her father's porch. She thought about Richard's whisper. She thought about Felton's shoes. She thought about a dead man who had poured concrete in secret because he knew that someday someone would come for what was buried beneath. 2 nights later, the old storage shed behind the farmhouse caught fire at 1:30 in the morning. Margaret smelled the smoke before she saw the light, acrid chemical wrong, in a way that wood smoke alone cannot achieve. By the time she reached the back door, the shed was fully engulfed, flames licking upward through the roof boards and sending a column of sparks into the black sky that looked like the valley was hemorrhaging light. Nate materialized from the darkness with a shovel and a garden hose connected to the outdoor spigot, and together they fought the fire for 40 minutes. until it collapsed into a smoldering heap of charred timber and melted roofing. No accelerant container was found. No footprint survived the heat and the water. The county fire marshal, who arrived the next morning in a truck older than Margaret's suitcase, listed the cause as probable electrical structure had no maintained wiring and closed the investigation before lunch. Margaret knew better. This was not a malfunction. This was punctuation, a period at the end of a sentence that read, "We know where you sleep." She picked up the phone and called Hargrove. Her voice carried no tremor, no hesitation. Only the flat, clear tone of a woman who had been pushed past the boundary where fear converts into purpose. "File the corrected deed and the mineral claim. We're going to war." Hargrove paused on the other end of the line, and in that pause, Margaret heard the particular silence of a lawyer recalculating risk. Then he spoke, and his voice matched hers, steady, professional, and aimed. "I'll have the filings ready by Friday. But Margaret, there's something you should know. I've been looking into Ridgeline Capital's corporate structure. They're a subsidiary of Appalachian Resource Partners, which is a holding company based in Richmond. And one of the listed investors in that holding company is a brokerage firm called Hollis and Brandt Financial." The name landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Hollis, not a common name in Richmond brokerage, not a coincidence. "The managing partner is Douglas Hollis Jr. I believe that's your ex-husband's brother." Margaret set the phone down on the kitchen table and stared at it as though it had transformed into something venomous. The pieces assembled themselves with the sickening precision of a puzzle she should have solved years ago. Richard knew about the farm. He knew because she had told him casually, carelessly, in the intimate confessions of early marriage, when a woman shares the geography of her childhood with the man she believes will protect it. She had mentioned the land, the hills, her father's obsession with the soil. And Richard, who catalogued information the way his father had catalogued assets, had filed it away and waited. He had not merely discarded her, he had positioned her, pushed her out of Virginia so the farm would appear abandoned, so Ridgeline could approach as a neutral buyer, so the transaction could be completed before Margaret understood what she was standing on. The marriage was not just a failure, it was a holding pattern. A 2-decade operation designed to keep her ignorant and compliant until the asset was ready to be seized. Margaret picked up the phone again and dialed June. It was Richard. It was always Richard. And now we know exactly what we're fighting. The legal war lasted 11 months, and it nearly broke her twice. Hargrove filed the corrected deed and mineral claim on a Friday morning in October. And by Monday afternoon, Ridgeline Capital's attorneys had responded with a motion to dismiss so dense with legal terminology. It read like a weapon designed to inflict damage through sheer volume. They contested the validity of Old Walt's survey on the grounds that Walter Briggs had never held a licensed surveyor certification from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. They argued that the Dunbar estate had functionally abandoned the 8 hidden acres by failing to record them for 4 decades, triggering a dormancy clause that would revert the land to state control. They filed a separate motion requesting the court impound the original maps and mineral reports pending an authenticity review, which Hargrove recognized immediately as a stalling tactic designed to separate Margaret from her evidence, the way a predator separates prey from the herd. The first 3 months were procedural trench warfare filings, counter-filings, discovery requests, and depositions that consumed Margaret's time, energy, and the cash her father had buried. Hargrove worked at a reduced rate because he believed in the case, but reduced was not free, and the ancillary costs expert witnesses, court fees, document reproduction, travel to Scranton for hearings devoured the money in the metal box with the steady appetite of something that feeds without satisfaction. Margaret sold timber from the north parcel to cover the shortfall, watching the logging trucks carry away trees her father had planted, and feeling each departure as a small amputation. Old Man Brewer testified in the 4th month, seated in the witness chair of the Lackawanna County Courthouse, with the composed authority of a man who had been swearing oaths on the truth since before most of the attorneys in the room were born. He described Henry Dunbar's unbroken presence on the land 30 years of Saturday morning, Visits to the general store, 30 years of tax payments, 30 years of fence mending and brush clearing, and the kind of continuous physical relationship with acreage that cannot be fabricated in a filing cabinet. Under cross-examination, Ridgeline's lead attorney attempted to suggest that Brewer's memory was unreliable, colored by sentimentality, the recollections of an old man confusing decades. Brewer removed his thick spectacles, cleaned them with a handkerchief, replaced them, and fixed the attorney with a gaze that carried the accumulated weight of 7 decades of watching people lie in a small town where lies travel at the speed of gossip. Son, I've been selling Henry Dunbar coffee since before your mother picked out your first name. I don't confuse anything, I remember. The courtroom shifted. Small moments like these did not win cases, but they established a gravitational field that pulled the narrative toward Margaret's version of events. A daughter defending her father's land against a corporation that had arrived with money and lawyers, and the assumption that enough of both could purchase anything. Nate stayed on the property full-time through the winter, occupying a corner of the farmhouse that Margaret converted into a makeshift room with a cot and a kerosene heater. His presence served a dual purpose: practical security against the nocturnal incursions that continued intermittently through November and December, and a companionship that asked nothing of her except proximity. They developed a routine that functioned on efficiency rather than conversation. Nate handled exterior repairs and property patrol, while Margaret managed the legal correspondence and the house itself. They shared meals in the kitchen, the cast-iron stove now functional and radiating a heat that transformed the room into the warmest space Margaret had occupied since Virginia. Though warmth measured differently here, calibrated not in thermostat degrees, but in the absence of threat. One evening in January, during a snowstorm that sealed the valley under a white silence so complete it felt architectural, Nate spoke more than she had ever heard him speak. They were sitting on opposite sides of the kitchen table, Margaret reviewing a deposition transcript, and Nate sharpening a tool on a whetstone, the rhythmic scraping providing a counterpoint to the wind outside. In Hellman, ma'am, the worst part was never the firefight. His voice arrived without preamble, as though he were resuming a conversation that had been paused rather than one that had never occurred. Firefights have a beginning and an end. You know when they start and you know when they're over. The worst part was the night before when you knew it was coming, but you couldn't see it yet. You'd lie there in the dark and decide whether to walk back into it at dawn. And every time you did, not because you weren't afraid, because there were people counting on you to show up. He did not look up from the whetstone. Margaret did not respond. The statement required no response because it was not advice. It was a mirror held up at an angle that allowed her to see herself. From a vantage point she could not have reached alone. The people counting on her. June, who called every third day with updates and encouragement, delivered in her particular blend of fury and tenderness. Tom, who had driven up twice more to walk the property lines with a level and a measuring tape gathering physical evidence that complemented the documentary record. Lily, who sent $200 every month and who called on Sunday evenings with questions about the farm that Margaret recognized as a daughter's way of saying, "I see you," without using the words. And Henry, who stood behind her from beyond the grave, his silence no longer an absence, but a presence, a hand on her shoulder, that she felt most acutely when the weight of the fight threatened to drive her to her knees. The case nearly collapsed in month 8. Ridgeline's attorneys retained a forensic document examiner from a university in Philadelphia, a credentialed expert with 3 decades of courtroom experience, who testified that the paper stock used in Old Walt survey maps was inconsistent with materials commercially available in 1977, suggesting the documents had been created or altered at a later date. The expert was thorough, precise, and devastating. Hargrove objected on procedural grounds, but the damage was atmospheric. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to skeptical, and Margaret watched from the plaintiff's table as the foundation of her case developed what felt like a fracture line running through its center. That night, she sat on the porch in the dark, the spring air carrying the first warmth of the season, and considered for the second time the mathematics of surrender. The money from the metal box was gone. The timber revenue was spent. Hargrove had stopped sending invoices, which meant he was either absorbing costs out of principle or preparing to withdraw. The farm was repaired enough to function, but not enough to sell for any meaningful amount without the mineral rights and without the survey maps. The mineral rights were unprovable. She called June. Her voice carried a fatigue so deep it had become tonal, coloring every syllable with the particular gray of someone who has been fighting a war she's no longer certain she can win. Maybe Dad was wrong, June. Maybe some fights aren't meant to be won. Maybe I should take whatever they'll still offer and walk away. The silence on the line lasted long enough for Margaret to hear her own breathing and the distant sound of June's teenagers arguing about something irrelevant in the background. When June spoke, her voice was stripped of its usual practicality, replaced by something rawer, something that sounded like it had been stored in the same part of the body where grief lives. He wasn't wrong, Margaret. He spent his entire life protecting that land for you. He poured concrete and buried maps and saved every dollar he could, because he believed he knew that someday you would need a place to stand. You don't get to quit now. Not when you're the only one left who can finish what he started. Margaret hung up and sat in the dark for another hour. The ridgeline was invisible against the sky, but she knew it was there. The way she knew the bones of her own body, by feel, by memory, by the accumulated knowledge of months spent walking its contours. Somewhere beneath that ridge, the calcite waited. It had waited for millennia before her father found it. It could wait longer. But she could not. She went inside and called Hargrove. I'm not quitting. Find another way to authenticate those maps. Hargrove found it 3 weeks later, not through paper analysis, but through the chemical composition of the ink. Old Walt had used a particular blend of India ink and iron gold that had been manufactured by a company in Scranton that went bankrupt in 1984. The ink was datable, traceable, and impossible to source after the manufacturer's closure. A second expert retained by Hargrove from Penn State's geology department confirmed that the mineral analysis sheets bore laboratory stamps and numbering systems consistent with the Scranton facility's records from 1982. The documents were not only authentic, they were anchored in a specific time and place with a precision that Ridgeline's expensive Philadelphia expert could not refute. The case turned, and then it broke open. During the discovery process mandated by the court in month 10, Hargrove's team obtained access to Ridgeline Capital's internal communications, a standard procedure that Ridgeline's attorneys had attempted to limit through a series of privilege claims that the judge systematically overruled. Among the thousands of pages of corporate correspondence buried in a subfolder labeled Appalachian Acquisitions Pre-Development, Hargrove found what Margaret had suspected since the night of the shed fire, but had never been able to prove. Emails, 47 of them spanning 3 years, exchanged between Richard Hollis and his brother, Douglas Hollis Jr., at Hollis and Brandt Financial. The correspondence mapped the entire operation with the incriminating clarity of men who believed their communications would never be read by anyone outside their circle. Richard had provided detailed information about the Dunbar farm, its location, its decades of dormancy, the likelihood that it contained mineral deposits based on geological surveys of adjacent properties. Douglas had channeled this intelligence to Ridgeline Capital through the intermediary of Appalachian Resource Partners, a holding company designed to create distance between the Hollis brothers and the acquisition. The timeline was damning. Richard's earliest email to Douglas predated Margaret's expulsion from the Virginia house by 14 months, confirming that the divorce papers, the hidden drawer, the whispered ultimatum, had not been a sudden eruption of marital cruelty, but the final step in a real estate play that had been in development for over a year. One email sent from Richard to Douglas, 6 weeks before he opened the Antique Bureau's hidden drawer, contained a sentence that Hargrove read aloud in the courtroom, and that Margaret would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. She doesn't know what's under that farm. She never cared about it. This will be easy. The final hearing took place on a Thursday morning in September, nearly a year to the day after Margaret had arrived in Clear Creek with a suitcase and $39. The courtroom was modest wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lighting, the institutional carpet, and suspended ceiling tiles of American municipal architecture. Margaret sat beside Hargrove at the plaintiff's table, her hands resting on the surface palms, down the calluses visible. Richard Hollis sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, positioned behind Ridgeline's legal team, in a chair that seemed to diminish him, or perhaps he had diminished himself, contracted inward over the months of exposure, until what remained was smaller than the man who had once filled a Virginia kitchen with the force of his whisper. He wore a suit that still fit, but no longer seemed to belong to him, the way a uniform belongs to a soldier, only as long as the soldier believes in the war. When Margaret entered the courtroom, his eyes found her and held for a fraction of a second before dropping to the table. What he saw was not the woman he had married or the woman he had expelled. It was someone he did not recognize, a woman with sun-darkened skin and work-hardened hands, and a stillness in her posture that communicated not fragility but mass. The particular density of someone who has been compressed by pressure until the unnecessary has been crushed away and only the essential remains. Hargrove presented the email chain with the methodical precision of a surgeon exposing a tumor. Each message was projected onto a screen, visible to the judge and the gallery, and with each new revelation the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, the silence deepening from attention to something closer to collective held breath. The kind of silence that accumulates when a room full of people recognizes they are witnessing not merely a legal proceeding, but the exposure of a betrayal so architecturally complete, it defied the normal vocabulary of divorce and real estate fraud. Richard's attorney requested a recess. The judge denied it. Margaret stood. Hargrove had not planned this. She had not discussed it with him, had not rehearsed it, had not even decided to do it until the moment arrived. And her body made the decision before her mind could intervene. She reached into the inside pocket of the jacket she had bought at a thrift store in Scranton for $7 and withdrew a piece of paper so creased and yellowed it looked like a relic from another century. Her father's letter. She read the opening lines aloud, her voice carrying across the courtroom with a clarity that owed nothing to volume and everything to conviction. If you're reading this, it means the world outside hasn't been as kind to you as I hoped it would be. The courtroom was silent. The judge's pen stopped moving. Richard's gaze remained fixed on the table in front of him, but his jaw tightened, and Margaret saw in that small muscular contraction the closest thing to shame that his architecture permitted. She did not read the entire letter. She read enough, the passage about the hidden acres, the calcite, the decades of secret stewardship, and then she folded the paper along its original creases and returned it to her pocket. She sat down. Hargrove rested his case. The judge ruled from the bench an unusual decision that signaled the clarity of his conclusions. The 8 acres were legally recognized as part of the Dunbar estate, their existence confirmed by authenticated survey documents, corroborated chemical analyses, and the testimony of community witnesses. The mineral rights were affirmed as belonging to Margaret and June Caldwell jointly. Ridgeline Capital's claims were dismissed with prejudice. The court referred the matter of the Hollis brothers' involvement to the county prosecutor's office for potential fraud charges. Margaret walked out of the courtroom into the September afternoon. The sun was high and warm, the same position and temperature as the day she had stood on a Virginia sidewalk with a suitcase and no future. She descended the courthouse steps and paused on the sidewalk, and for a moment the symmetry was so precise it felt staged. A woman on a sidewalk blinking in the sunlight, everything different and nothing visible to indicate why. She was nearly to her car, Tom's sedan, which he had lent her for the duration of the trial, when she became aware of someone standing in the shadow of the courthouse portico. Richard. He had emerged from a side door and was standing against the limestone wall with his hands in his pockets, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his posture carrying a desolation so complete It had become structural, built into the way his shoulders curved inward, as though protecting something that had already been taken. Margaret stopped, not because she wanted to speak to him, and not because she wanted to hear anything he might say, but because the woman who had signed papers without reading them, who had endured whispers and slammed fists and the slow erosion of 23 years, owed the woman she had become the dignity of looking directly at what she had survived. She looked at Richard Hollis. She saw a man who had inherited his father's conviction that love was a form of ownership, and who had pursued that conviction to its logical end, controlling a woman until there was nothing left to control, and then discarding her in the direction of the last asset he had not yet seized. She saw a man drowning in the consequences of his own arithmetic. His brother's firm collapsing his legal exposure, widening the house in Virginia, the house with the granite countertops, and the hidden drawer in the early stages of bank foreclosure. She saw a man who had spent his life trying to possess things, and who now possessed nothing. Not even the coherent self-pity that might have made his ruin feel meaningful. She felt no triumph, no vindication, no rage. What she felt was a sorrow so clean it was almost peaceful. The particular grief of watching someone destroy themselves with tools they mistook for power. She turned and walked to the car. She did not look back. This time the choice carried no fear and no loss. She had simply finished with that direction. The weeks that followed moved with the accelerating momentum of a life reorganizing itself around possibility rather than survival. The university geologist completed his comprehensive survey of the 8 acres and confirmed that the calcite deposits exceeded Old Walt's original estimates. The limestone was not merely high-grade but exceptional, the kind of pure crystalline formation that occurs in fewer than a dozen sites across the eastern seaboard. Mining companies from 3 states began making inquiries through Hargrove's office, their offers escalating. With each new geological report, the numbers climbing into territory that Margaret processed not as wealth, but as the physical manifestation of her father's patience, decades of silence converted into figures on a page. She chose the offer that Henry Dunbar would have chosen. A family-owned stone company based 40 miles north, operated by a father and 2 sons who had been quarrying Pennsylvania limestone for 3 generations. They proposed a sustainable extraction plan, limited tonnage per year, no open-pit mining methods that protected the creek and the forest canopy, a 20-year contract with annual environmental reviews. In exchange, Margaret and June would receive a percentage of net revenues that Hargrove described with characteristic understatement as meaningful. The first royalty check arrived on a Tuesday in November. Margaret opened the envelope at the kitchen table, the same table where she had opened the metal box, the same table where she had read her father's letter. The same surface that had held the full weight of every revelation this house had produced. The number on the check exceeded the total amount of money she had accessed during her entire marriage. She set it down on the table and looked at it for a long time, not with joy or relief, but with a feeling she could not name until later that evening, when she realized it was the feeling of a promise being kept by someone who was no longer alive to keep it. She restored the farmhouse. A contractor from Scranton replaced the roof and added a wide wraparound porch with railings made from locally milled oak. A plumber installed modern fixtures alongside the original hand pump, which Margaret insisted remained functional at the kitchen sink, not as a backup, but as a monument. A reminder that everything she had built in this second life had begun with a woman pumping water from stone. The kitchen was modernized, new appliances, new countertops, proper lighting. But the cast iron stove remained restored and operational, occupying its original position against the east wall like an anchor that refused to be moved regardless of what changed around it. In the bedroom, the iron bed frame received a new mattress, but kept its original springs, which still creaked in the same key they had creaked when Margaret first lay down on them, with nothing between her body and the metal but a folded winter coat. She established a trust fund for Lily, not a lump sum, but a structured account that would release funds in increments tied to specific milestones. She did not want to give her daughter money. She wanted to give her daughter ground, a foundation that could not be signed away by anyone else's pen, a starting point from which Lily could build whatever she chose to build, using whatever tools she chose to use. Nate accepted Margaret's offer of a half-acre parcel at the western edge of the property near the tree line, where the land leveled out into a natural clearing, sheltered from the prevailing wind. He refused any payment beyond the land itself and began building a cabin by hand, felling timber, squaring logs, setting foundation stones with the same deliberate precision he applied to everything. Margaret watched the structure rise over the weeks, each course of logs adding height and definition, and recognized in the process a version of what she herself had been doing since the day she arrived, constructing shelter from raw material, converting damage into architecture, building not a house, but the physical evidence that survival is possible. The evening Lily arrived was warm for late October. The kind of autumn afternoon that occurs in the Appalachian foothills, when the season pauses between surrender and severity, the trees holding their remaining leaves in colors so saturated they looked artificial. Margaret was on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the light change on the ridge, when she heard an engine laboring up the dirt drive. Not Tom's sedan, not Nate's truck, but something unfamiliar, smaller, struggling with the grade. A 10-year-old hatchback rounded the bend and stopped in front of the gate. Lily stepped out. She was thinner than the last time Margaret had seen her, her face carrying the particular hollowness of someone who has recently subtracted a significant portion of their life. Her eyes were ringed with the blue-gray shadows of accumulated sleepless nights, but her posture was vertical, her chin level, and her hands hung at her sides without fidgeting, the stance of someone who has arrived at a destination rather than fled from one. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her mother. The distance between them was 6 feet of wooden staircase and 27 years of a relationship shaped by a marriage that had taught both of them the wrong lessons about strength. I left Jake. I quit the restaurant. A pause. The ridge behind the house caught the last horizontal light and held it. Mom, I know what I did. When you called that day and I told you to be strong, that was the cruelest thing anyone has ever said to you. And I said it because I was scared, and because you taught me without meaning to that asking for help was weakness. I'm not going to say I'm sorry because sorry is just a word. I'm here. That's what I have. Margaret looked at her daughter and saw the geometry of repetition. A young woman standing at the threshold of a house that belonged to someone else, carrying nothing but what she could fit in a car, asking not for rescue, but for the chance to begin. She saw herself at 29 walking up a church aisle toward a man she did not understand. She saw herself at 52 pushing open a rusted gate with her shoulder. She saw the circle that families draw around themselves generation after generation, each daughter inheriting the previous mother's definition of endurance, each mother passing down not wisdom, but coping mechanisms disguised as character. She could break the circle here. Not by forgiving easily. Forgiveness offered without cost is indistinguishable from permission, but by doing what her father had done, offering ground without conditions and trust without guarantees, believing that the person standing in front of you is capable of building something worth standing on. There's a room inside, but this isn't a place where people come to rest, Lily. This is a place where people come to work. You build here or you don't stay. Nobody carries you. Nobody lives your life except you. Lily's jaw tightened in a way that Margaret recognized the same muscular contraction she had seen in her own reflection during the worst nights in Virginia, the set of a face preparing to accept terms that are difficult because they are honest. I know, Mom. She climbed the steps, sat in the chair beside Margaret. Neither of them spoke. The valley filled with the blue-violet light of early evening, the ridge dissolving into silhouette, the first stars appearing above the tree line, with the tentative brightness of something that has been waiting for permission to be seen. From the far edge of the property, through the thinning trees, the glow of Nate's cabin window flickered warm, small and steady. The light of another person rebuilding in the dark. 3 lives, each one constructed from wreckage. 3 sets of hands, each one calloused in different places. Three versions of the same truth, that the only ground worth standing on is the ground you have cleared yourself, and the only shelter worth trusting is the one you have built with your own blistered, honest, undefeated hands. Margaret Dunbar leaned back in her chair. The oak railing was solid beneath her palm. New wood rough cut, still carrying the scent of the sawmill. The chimney rose above the roofline behind her, straight and vertical against the darkening sky, unchanged since the day she arrived. Unchanged since the day her father built it. A column of limestone standing in the same posture it would hold for another 100 years. She was not the ghost of her mistakes. She was not the sum of the years spent in someone else's kitchen. She was the daughter of a man who had loved her in the only language he spoke, the language of buried treasure, and poured concrete and a single question, asked once at a church door and never repeated. She was the mother of a girl who had finally learned that strength is not the absence of need, but the willingness to stand up after admitting you have it. She was the owner of 26 acres of stubborn Pennsylvania earth that had waited for her with the patience of stone. The valley darkened. The stars multiplied. And in the silence, the deep layered silence of a place that had been holding its breath for 14 years, if she listened carefully enough, past the wind and the creek, and the distant sound of Nate's hammer striking a nail into new wood, she could hear her father nod.